Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SRHM Podcast, which explores new research and emerging trends in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, with a focus on using rights-based knowledge for action.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eszter Kismődi, Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters. My guest today is Datta, a long-term colleague, founder and executive director of the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, EPF, a network of parliamentarians across 30 countries that has helped shape laws, policies, and budgets on reproductive rights in Europe and beyond. Neil is one of the world's leading experts on anti-gender and anti-rights movements whose investigative reports have informed civil society, journalists, and lawmakers around the world. His work, your work, Neil, has earned you the Don and Arvon Fraser Human Rights Award and recognition from the French Senate for his role, your role, Neil, in the constitutional protection of abortion in France. Today, we are talking about EPF's new report, The Next Wave, How Religious Extremism is Reclaiming Power. Neil, welcome. Thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thank you, Eszter. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So let's go and introduce this report in the context of the trilogy. The Next Wave documents the accelerating financial expansion of movements working to dismantle sexual and reproductive rights across Europe, tracing more than 207 anti-rights actors between 2019 and 2023. Their money, their professionalization, and their capture of institution parties, even states. Your report really, Neil, blew my mind. Although we have talking about it, the level of details that you are providing is just so important. But it's also important to recognize that this report is the third in a trilogy. The tip of the iceberg showed how this movement mobilized over $700 million between 2009 and 2018. And now the Next Wave finds $1.18 billion in just 5 years. So just start our conversation, and for listeners new to your work, what did each report uncover and what made you realize a next wave was coming?
Yeah, thank you, Eszter. So the first report that we did was entitled Restoring the Natural Order, and that came out in 2018. And that's basically how we describe the transnational network that was operating in Europe, aiming to roll back human rights on gender and sexual and reproductive health. And that was important to get out at that time because we had all of us working in sexual reproductive health and rights in Europe at that time had been noticing an uptick in this type of mobilization, but we still had an outdated frame of reference for it. We still looked at it as instances of domestic, national level grassroots social conservatism, whereas we could see there was something more than that. There was a transnational network behind it. They had been meeting since 2013. They had plans, they had funders, they had insiders inside them, governments and institutions, and we were able to explore how this network was created and what they had been able to accomplish over a 5-year period. So that was Restoring the Natural Order. Then came our second report, that was Tip of the Iceberg. And the reasons for this report are twofold. One was the reaction to our first report was basically people were saying, Neil, that's very nice that you've explained how this anti-gender network is organized, but what about the money behind it? Okay. And so that's something that we thought would be useful to explore. And then came COVID, and I was under lockdown like everybody else. And so that became my lockdown hobby of tracking down the funding behind all of the anti-gender organizations that we had identified. And and this became the report that we released in 2021 entitled Tip of the Iceberg. And we were able to show that there was behind this network, which had since expanded since 2018, there were a number of organizations which had been able to amass approximately $700 million over a 10-year period. And now we come to the latest one, which is the next wave. That was meant to be an easier lift. I had originally planned to release an update of Tip of the Iceberg to come out in 2024 in line with the European elections, so that like this, we would have a 5-year overview of how the movement, the anti-gender movement had evolved. And it soon became apparent as we were updating the financial data on that this movement had vastly expanded. And so it took a longer time to analyze the data and then to make sense of it. And that's why we only released it, in fact, a year after the original date. We came out with it almost a year ago in June 2025. And that's where we were able to show that, that this anti-gender movement had gone beyond just anti-gender contestation. We also need to consider it an anti-human rights and perhaps even an anti-liberal project, and had itself amassed almost $1.2 billion over the past 5 years. So if we take a look at how much money has been going into this, in 2009, we're at $20 million a year. By 2018, we have quadrupled to $80 million a year. And by 2022, we are at $270 million a year. So over the past 15 years or so, we can say that this movement has really evolved, if not mutated, into an entirely different animal than what we thought we knew in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights contestation.
So in terms of the anatomy of this funding and the anatomy of this your report, you map it across 7 types of organization: advocacy and lobbying, public engagement and media, the grant-making foundation, anti-gender service providers, political parties and think tanks, and strategic litigators, and across 3 geographies: Europe, split between EU and non-EU countries, Russia, and the European spending of US-based organizations. You talk beyond the money and analyze, and you trace the movement's evolution across 5 intertwined dimensions: religious ideology, civil society organizations, political engagement, knowledge production, and geopolitical reach. And you argue that understanding these dimensions and the funding behind them is vital for developing effective defenses. And to me, it's very clear after reading the report, why is it so strategically important? Before going into details on each, can you please walk us through this landscape, how you set your report and analysis?
Yeah. Thank you. And you've already done an excellent job in laying out the basic framework of it. But what we did, when we take a look at the almost $1.2 billion, okay, what we wanted to do is identify what does this make up, okay? And so what we did is take a look at each individual organization that's in our data set, and we attributed to them more or less what is their main area of activity. So we can see that the majority of organizations are what we call advocacy and lobbying organizations. That's not necessarily a surprise, because that's how we encounter anti-gender activism. But the second one was the media organizations. So I think there is a revelation to us. We know that these organizations have been more prevalent in social media and outreach, but the fact that it's their number 2 area of financial concentration was something interesting. Another area was also then the philanthropic ecosystem. And that, we need to understand that whereas on our side, we have the Gates Foundation, SIF, Sigrid Housing Trust, all the private foundations that may be supportive of sexual reproductive health and rights, gender equality, women's rights, LGBT rights, there is an alternative ecosystem, much more discrete, that does exist and that is funding this movement. And then we have a number of the other ones. A new category that emerged was really the knowledge production. And by that, we mean think tanks. Think tanks producing ideas which are anti-gender in character are a relatively new phenomenon in Europe. They're well known, well established on the other side of the Atlantic, but we need to realize that over the past 5-7 years, we have our own ecosystem of such think tanks. They are well established in their home countries. Some of them are operating at European level, and they have networked with each other and with their transatlantic partners. Then if we take a look at the fund, where does the money come from? 10 to 12% of it comes from the United States. That's really concentrated in litigation and not a huge surprise, if not the fact that it's so little coming from the United States. And that is a fairly secure number because the US financial reporting is very solid and relatively transparent. That is funding focused on litigation. Next area was the Russian Federation, accounting to 20 to 25%. That should be a red flag that this has a geopolitical dimension. Okay, and we can get into that a bit later. And that's really concentrated in far-right political parties and influence factories meant to socialize Western economic, cultural, and political elites onto a pro-Russian agenda. And the rest of it, about between 60 and 70% of it, comes from Europe itself. So that's where the biggest growth has taken place, and we can discuss the details of how this has been happening. But we need to note that in Europe, this is a self-funded problem that we're dealing with, and I think already that helps us understand the issue. And then finally, in order to see really how anti-gender activism and mobilization was manifesting itself, what we did was break it down into 5 different, what we call dimensions of activity. The first one was the religious dimension, where anti-gender activism starts from, in terms of the social doctrine of different churches, usually Christian churches, primary among them the Catholic Church. From there, it went into the world of civil society. Think of pro-life, anti-abortion organizations that exist in almost every country, which have since modernized and transnationalized. From the world of civil society to the world of politics, that I would say is the new epicenter of the anti-gender mobilization in Europe. Then onto knowledge production, and then finally, when these political parties, anti-gender far-right political parties, are successful and they're doing rather well across Europe, they are able to wield the power of states and engage in anti-gender statecraft, domestically and internationally. And that's what we detail in the report.
So I think the uniqueness, absolute uniqueness of your report is in the details. And it's a fascinating read because it's really page by page is eye-opening. So let's go to the sources of funding, what is part 1 of your report. Can you please walk us through the US, the American money, and the strategy, actually how they operate, how this American funding, American money actually operate on European soil? Where does it originate and how does it reach Europe? And could you also give concrete examples, because I think your concrete examples are fascinating, and then maybe for our audience, SRHM audience, the Alliance Defending Freedom operation in Europe, that is an organization behind the Dobbs case that overturned Roe versus Wade now. As you point out, both 35 wins before the European Court of Human Rights. So what this American style of lawfare means, for example, for rights protection in Europe, but again, the bigger picture, how this American money looks like.
Yeah. Yes. So the American money is relatively easy to understand. Okay. So we have a certain number of US organizations present in Europe. They either have partners in Europe and then they spend a bit of money with their partners. We can all understand that system. Or a number of them, a smaller subset, have offices in Europe. So what's interesting is where in Europe they have offices. Their offices tend to be concentrated in Brussels, Strasbourg, Geneva, Vienna, and to a certain extent, London and Rome. So with the first four cities I mentioned, these are all the seats of European or international institutions. They're not going to the pretty cities of Europe, such as Paris or Berlin or Madrid. They're going where power rests. So that's one thing that we need to take from it. Another aspect of US money is that it's all private money, okay? At least for the time being. So it's private money. So how does this money get to Europe? We go back to the United States, and basically the trail is fairly easy to track. You have wealthy US families. These families tend to be closely aligned with the Republican Party. And if they were Russian, we would call them oligarchs, but in the US, we call them billionaires. These are basically Republican Party donors, okay? So we have these wealthy families. They set up private foundations. There's tax benefits in the United States for doing this, like everywhere. These private foundations then fund US anti-gender organizations, such as Alliance Defending Freedom, the American Center for Law and Justice, the Heritage Foundation, and so on and so forth. And then from these US organizations in the United States, they then set up shop in Europe, either through partnerships or through having offices. So one example is Alliance Defending Freedom has offices in Vienna, in London. They are registered in France and in Belgium. They used to have an office in Belgium, and they may be present in other countries as well. So that's how the US money gets here. And now, if we take a look at what are they doing, I had said earlier, litigation. The American organizations bring decades of US experience of litigation on social issues. We need to remember that the US is quite different from Europe on social issues. Whereas with us in Europe, most of our social issues, whether it's contraception, abortion, equal marriage, etc., and everything in between, usually in most countries, these are regulated by acts of parliament. Not so in the US, going all the way back to contraception, but then abortion, equal marriage, these are decisions of the US Supreme Court. And so this means that there's several decades more experience of litigation on the US side compared to Europe. And they're hunting for cases to take before different courts. A concrete example of what Alliance Defending Freedom is doing, they try to take the state of Sweden to court before the European Court of Human Rights because of Sweden's legislation regarding abortion, where it does not permit for conscientious objection. In Sweden, the idea is that if one voluntarily chooses to be a midwife or to practice gynecology, you are choosing this field, and this field includes, by its very nature, the practice of abortion. They found one case of a midwife called Elinor Grimark, who claimed to be Christian and to be the victim of discrimination because she would not perform abortion and therefore could not be hired as a midwife in her country. She took the case before her local courts in Sweden, eventually all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights with the help of Alliance Defending Freedom. She eventually lost. But this shows that they are looking for cases to set precedent on issues related to sexual reproductive health and rights.
I'm very pleased to hear that the European Court of Human Rights are upholding there are nuances about that these public health institutions, that the access to health services compared to the US is a very strong human rights in Europe. And I think maybe this is what they miscalculated big time, that in Europe access to health care is a very strong fundamental human right. So let's move to Russia. As you pointed out, it's not an ordinary philanthropy. It's a state-backed movement where preventing abortion is framed as both a moral imperative and a demographic strategy. For example, you also mentioned oligarchs. You mentioned in your report that the pandemic, the sanctions, and the invasion of Ukraine broke those networks and drove the money inwards partially. So what is the nature of the Russian anti-gender funding today, although reading the history of it and the context of the past 20 years or 15 years is also very fascinating. But how does it look like today? And even turned inwards, what parallels should Europe still be drawing?
Yeah, the Russian funding is interesting because it from out of nowhere in 2008. By 2012, 2013, it quickly becomes the biggest financial backer of anti-gender activism on the European continent. So something happened there. We then need to take a look at Russian foreign policy. It is Russian formal foreign policy to support the idea of the traditional family. And this goes back to about 2012. Okay. Like a number of things in the Russian system, there is a formal policy that has come out of the Kremlin and is supported by the foreign minister Lavrov, but the actual implementation can then be entrusted to private entrepreneurs. And we have two Russian oligarchs who are both known for being very conservative, very religious, and even far right in their intentions, Konstantin Malafeyev and Vladimir Yakunin. And basically, what a number of academics have found is that they have created what they call an influence factory. So these influence factories are composed of different strands. On the one hand, there are NGOs, then there are think tanks, then there are media operations. So a YouTube media, podcasts, newspapers, television channels, and then separately, there's support for transnational networks, usually political in nature. So we have that coming from the Russian Federation, and then a separate arm of financial support to far-right political parties in Western Europe. Now, as you mentioned, this came to an end starting in 2014, and then really all trace of Russian money is gone with the start of the Ukraine war, where even a more severe series of sanctions were imposed. What happens is two things in two directions. One, we see that the Russian money does not fully disappear. It's simply concentrated in Russia and in the few countries where they still can export their ideas to. Belarus, to a certain extent, Serbia. Then a new actor steps in, starting around 2016, 2017, and that is Hungary. And what we see is that Hungary develops a rather similar mechanism of influence factories as the Russian model. So that from the office of Prime Minister Orban, we have state assets which are privatized to people close to his oligarchic clique. They are entrusted or take over philanthropic or private foundations, and these foundations then fund a similar system composed of NGOs, think tanks, media, and transnational networks. And then there's a separate arm that goes via a bank closely associated with the prime minister, the former prime minister Orban, which then provides financial support to a number of European-level far-right political parties. And so what we see is that there's Hungarian financial relationships with political parties which account for more than 50% of the third largest political group in the European Parliament, namely the far-right Patriots for Europe. So what we have with the Hungarian system is knowledge and content production coming from the think tanks, grassroots support being echoed for this knowledge by the NGOs. This is then socialized within the transnational networks involving parliamentarians, politicians, and NGOs from all around the world, and translated into real concrete political activities such as parliamentary questions, amendments, resolutions in the European Parliament, and all of this designed to shape EU funding and policies related to health, human rights, gender, and going so far as free media and academic freedom and environmental policies. We have from the Russian system, we then transition to the Hungarian system.
And we will come back to Hungary because I think it's an important point in history that Fidesz and Viktor Orbán lost. I wish that my dear country would be famous about poetry and music and architecture and not about Orbán and the global politics of anti-rights movement. Let's just pause it for a moment and go to the private funding. You said that more than 60%, I think you mentioned, is coming from private money. Whose money is this private money, and what is it actually buying?
Yeah. So, a great deal of funding comes from what we can find is the private money, so private sector, and several different sources there. One, we have about as many wealthy individuals, millionaires and billionaires in Europe as there are in the United States. So we have our own wealthy people, and that can fund this type of cause, and they do. So that's one source. Another source is a subset of these these wealthy families are the old families of Europe. So what I thought had previously been a rather curious eccentricity among the anti-gender networks, where they would have archduchesses, duchesses, princess or prince involved in their different activities, it looks like it's an organized system where the old wealth of Europe is harnessed and leveraged towards this type of anti-gender activism. And I had to do a bit of historical research where I learned that when many of Europe's aristocratic regimes were abolished about the end of the First World War, the aristocratic families, mainly in Central Europe, they may have been deprived of their titles and political influence, but in many cases in Germany and in Austria, they were able to preserve their lands, their wealth, their castles, their forests, etc. And even today, they remain among the wealthiest families in Central Europe. So that's another source of funding. We also see that the anti-gender organizations have also specifically targeted like the provincial elites, not necessarily the billionaires, but the local millionaires in smaller provincial towns. And they've involved them through small business organizations, in platforming them in different places, and then providing them an opportunity to support local, usually faith-based initiatives that have an anti-gender objective.
It's fascinating to see the stories. Some of the stories are almost cinematic. For example, the German princess. And as I was reading it, I'm like, who is against condoms for young people, against marriage for all, against abortion and denying man-made climate change, seeing the words of Habsburgs. Beyond the money, maybe you wanted to go there, but I think it was also very important to see that what do they bring beyond the money and beyond the wealth?
Yeah. So these aristocrats, they bring some money. And in fact, in Germany, there is one foundation called Stiftung Ja zum Leben, the foundation Yes to Life. And when we take a look at their board, it is composed of these princesses, duchesses, etc. It's diabolical to find out who they are because they're all related to each other in some way. There's a researcher in Germany that does this work very well, but it's an interesting dive into European history to figure this out. What else do they bring aside from money? Well, they bring a certain prestige to the issue. If you can have a well-known personality with a good pedigree supporting your cause, then you increase the visibility of your cause. They get access to certain media, perhaps, etc. Also, it reinforces a certain type of worldview that is based on legitimized inequality. Okay, and I think that's an important thing to consider. And themselves, the aristocrats, why would they be involved in this? We need to go back in history and understand that when their families became aristocratic, they were essentially some local warlord in the Middle Ages that was granted a certain recognition by the secular leader, by the king or emperor or whatever, and this was then validated by ecclesiastical authorities. And so the very nature of aristocracy rests upon religious legitimation. And like in many societies in our own, but all across the world, it is the role of wealthy people, the notables in society, to give something back to the community. And what they give back is guided by what the religious authorities tell them is useful. So this may include houses for pregnant women so that they don't have to go through an abortion. It may be alternatives to comprehensive sexuality education. It could be alternatives to family planning. And we see that these aristocrats then are all involved in these types of alternative services.
One of the most painful source to see is the EU funding or EU-related funding. It's really something that we are so proud of. In Europe, the EU, how the EU is upholding human rights and principles and collaboration and being European, and seeing that the European funding is going to the anti-rights movement is very, very painful. So how does taxpayers' money end up financing the dismantling of taxpayer rights?
Yeah.
And where is the line between design and neglect here? And I have to say that I was rather shocked that, for example, the Erasmus program that is supporting generations. I'm from Hungary. We came out of communism. Whoever studied in abroad about democracy got Erasmus scholarships, and now the Erasmus scholarships are coming funded by ideology. So how the EU funding looks like?
Yeah. So public funding accounted for a significant percentage of the financing that we were able to track, and what we found in terms of public funding is quite secure. The source coming from and there's various reasons why there's public funding. One source, which is easy to understand, is public funding coming, for example, from illiberal or governments which are declining in democracy. So that was a big source. That's why Hungary stands out as the #1 source of this type of funding. Poland is up there as well under the previous government. So that's one source of public funding, and we can all understand what that is. That was by design to create, to advance the domestic and foreign policy objectives of an illiberal anti-gender government. Then there's another category, which is accidental. And this was quite well documented in another report looking at funding behind the anti-LGBT laws that were proposed in Uganda, where inadvertently some of the big bilateral donors were funding organizations in Uganda that were supporting the anti-LGBT bill. So, and this was through a program of block grants, which then have many subgrantees, etc. That was by mistake. But what we have somewhere is with the EU Erasmus program is somewhere in the middle, where there we have an anti-gender organization, but with a very, very, very acceptable facade. They go by a youth organization, and they say that they're active on reproductive health, which they are, but they have been active and founded in order to go against the ICPD program of action. So there's quite a bit of cynicism coming from the organization. And they had an ally in the European Commission all the way back in 2009. And this ally, who was then commissioner, was able to give them a first grant of about 50,000 euros. And then once you're in the system for the European Commission, you develop credibility, and then it's easier to secure additional grants. And so they had been receiving on average 60,000 euros per year since 2009. And then just a few years ago, they secured a very big grant of 400,000 euros for a program on women's health called Women's Health Goes Digital. And this program was specifically designed to develop an app for natural family planning. And when we take a look further, who is behind this app developed by this youth organization, then we find that it is professors associated with the University of Nevada in Spain, a university that openly claims its affiliation to Opus Dei on its website. And so we see that the idea behind the natural family planning is based on a whitewashing of Catholic teaching. And the proposal that the World Youth Alliance, that's the name of the organization, had proposed, talks about women's health, talks about reproductive health. It uses all of the vocabulary that any one of us would recognize. But the objective is the opposite. It is to deny women of their choice. We knew that something was fishy with this organization, and that's why we encouraged media to take a look at this. Several media articles then investigated this, and a number of MEPs then asked parliamentary questions to the Commission, asking them, please take a look at this project. There's something behind this. And eventually the European Commission ordered an independent evaluation and found that it was even more in breach of EU values related to equality, non-discrimination, and just access to basic scientific information. It was even more in breach of this than what we could have ever imagined, and recommended the suspension of all funding to this organization. That's as of November last year. And right now, the organization in question is appealing this process. And so the discussions are taking place now. But at least, hopefully, there's a good end to the story.
So when we go to the public funding, it's both public funding nationally and public funding in the EU. And you have a dedicated part for Hungary. I mean, we talk about the 10 million people nation. But somehow it's always strategically important, Second World War, Habsburgs, Austro-Hungarian Empire, because Hungary is between East and West, and now it got the attention of Trump in the past 16 years. But now Hungary, they lost the election big time. 2/3 is now, there is a new government who is really going against specifically the dismantling of the democratic institutions, and one of the main pillars is to reinstate and very, very strongly reinstate the principles of democracy. So how do you think that the disappearance of Orbán may distract this politics around the funding?
Well, one, I'm very happy with what happened in Hungary. And Prime Minister Magyar has already announced that he plans to tackle some of the funding that the previous Prime Minister was allocating to these types of issues, among them funding for this Conservative Political Action Committee that met in Budapest and gathered far-right leaders. But I haven't yet heard whether his attention to the CPAC, which was perhaps the most visible of these anti-gender initiatives, would also apply to the less visible ones. And so that's something that we need to get onto their radar. And then also, we need to see how exactly the funding from Hungary was actually managed, because it may have been advanced or front-loaded to private entities, which may have enough money to keep things rolling for the next couple of years. So I don't know enough about how things work in Hungary to see whether any of that funding, which is ultimately public funding in some way, can be clawed back. But there are parliamentary questions looking into this, as well as whether that type of Hungarian funding had an influence on the politics of other countries, so that it is already in Chile that a member of the Chilean Congress has asked a parliamentary question about whether Hungarian funding for a network called Political Network for Values had any influence on the president of that network at the time, Political Network for Values, becoming the president of the country, Antonio Cast. A member of the US Congress, from a Democrat from Pennsylvania, asked a similar question because Vice President J.D. Vance also participated in events that are known to have been sponsored by Hungary. And just last week, it's a coalition of different MEPs that asked a similar question to the European Commission about what is being done to track the possible use of EU funding to Hungary, and how this may have been used to undermine EU values. Related to all of this is also the possibility of Russian funding behind behind the Hungarian funding for the well-known associations that have been revealed in the press recently.
So let's move, Neil, to the 5 dimensions of anti-rights and anti-religious extremist activism. I left out the parties. Please go back to the report, but I think it's important to move now to the content. And can you just explain these 5 dimensions and maybe just start with the religious roots then?
Yeah. So we divided up the anti-gender mobilization across 5 dimensions. The first one is the religious dimension. We need to remember that modern anti-gender activism owes its origins to religious thinking, and specifically Catholic thinking, who conceptualized the notion of gender ideology as being a catch-all to understand everything bad in society: contraception, abortion, LGBT, etc. 2 things we find with the religious dimension. One is that, or 3 things. One is that it has spread widely beyond the world of Catholicism. So we have traditionalist Protestant communities all over Europe picking this up, not the mainline Protestant churches, but traditionalist communities. And then the biggest new thing is the Orthodox churches of the East really picking this up, starting with the Russians and then spreading like wildfire throughout the rest of the world of Orthodoxy, so that now almost every Orthodox church is involved in anti-gender activism. Another thing that we see with religious activism is the religious hierarchies have all become more conservative in their doctrines on social issues and have equally called upon the faithful to be more politically engaged. And then finally, a sophistication in their representation, namely the creation of what we call chongos, church-organized NGOs. So these are NGOs legally, but when you scratch beneath the surface and you take a look at who's running them, who's on their board, how are they funded, and what's in their statutes, we find that they are the civil society outreach of a religious hierarchy. We have that happening within the world of within the religious dimension.
Can I ask, because listeners might not be familiar with the religious composition. So can you just talk about the religious composition? Because it's also, I think, very interesting. How is it different, the 3 that you explain?
Yeah. So in terms of the religious composition, so we have the Catholic Church, mainly Catholic thinkers who produced this idea of gender ideology, which was then adopted and taken up by the hierarchy itself, and then from the Vatican Holy See hierarchy, it then spread out through the world of Catholicism, including many of the civil society organizations closely associated with that. But a good idea is a good idea. And so we saw that after the Catholics, the traditionalist Protestants picked up on the same issue. So religious groups, the mainline Catholics and traditionalist Protestants, who really don't get along in some countries, are able to find common ground on anti-gender activism. And then finally, we see that the Russian Orthodox were the first among the world of Orthodoxy to pick this up. Christina Stockel, an academic from Austria, has described this very well, where basically after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the church regained its freedom, but was intellectually bankrupt after 70 years of oppression. And so what happened is that they incorporated a number of ideas from the American Christian right, because again, these were good ideas, and then gradually became much more socially conservative. And then from the Moscow Patriarchate, it then spread to the other Orthodox patriarchates with whom they have very close relations. So first to Belgrade, to the Serbian Orthodox Church, and then from there to other Orthodox churches. And so we see that as of recently, Orthodox churches, whereas 5-7 years ago, they had been silent on most gender reproductive health issues, have now become vocal and vocally against it. And specifically, 2 catalysts provoke them. One, in a number of countries, it is the organization of pride marches, so that out of nowhere we see now that the Orthodox churches are very much taking open positions influencing politicians around this and trying to stop the holding of marches. Another area was the Istanbul Convention on Gender-Based Violence, where we there see the Orthodox churches questioning the notion of gender and also the notion of the equality of men and women, rather emphasizing the notion of the complementarity of men and women, and therefore going against the Istanbul Convention.
When you get to civil society, you started to talk about the church-organized NGOs.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce it?
Chongo, yeah. Yeah.
And you say, beware the wolf in sheep's clothing. Why are you saying that?
Yes, and that's because a number of these chongos, church-organized NGOs, they look and appear like normal NGOs, simply a little bit more conservative. And they act like NGOs. But when you then scratch beneath the surface, you see that it's basically just the outreach of, in some cases, the Catholic Church, in other cases, other religious institutions into the world of civil society. And we need to be aware of this. There's nothing illegal about this, but we need to know who these organizations are. One of them, which is an organization which is, I mean, the fact that they're a chongo is very obvious because they share their offices with the Conference of Catholic Bishops. Okay, so there's same offices. This organization was elected as co-chair of the Gender Equality NGO Working Group at the Council of Europe. So they were able to pass this this credibility in order to get access to that level. The same organization also regularly applies for funding, and the European Commission just recently, in November, December of last year, denied several of their funding applications because upon closer analysis, the European Commission found that this organization does not meet the EU values of inclusion and diversity and equality. So we need
and it's not only about the equality and the human rights. You also introduce the term of faith-based science that is being used by scholars, and how religious ideology repackaged as research shapes secular policy, and it's becoming obvious. Can you talk about that?
What we found is a whole system in place where you have people involved in academic institutions, but these academic institutions are usually linked to a certain religious institution. So let's take the University of Navarra, for example, which really stands out as being very much
in Spain, right?
In Spain,
yeah.
Okay. University of Navarra it was founded by the Opus Dei prelature. This is overtly advertised on their website. It's a university dedicated to Saint Josemaria Escrivá. So we have academics associated there who are in the field of usually, in this case, endocrinology. And then they set up a separate organization, one of them by a very reasonable sounding name, Reproductive Health Research Institute. They could compete with SRHM.
So they have a journal? Not yet, but getting there.
They publish their own peer-reviewed papers, which then serve as a source of reference for civil society groups, among them the World Youth Alliance, which has created an offshoot called the Fun Foundation, in order to provide evidence for their natural family planning approach. So you have a closed system there of grassroots organizations, youth organizations, and an anti-gender service on family planning, referencing evidence coming from one of their own who is associated with a religious institution. So it's a closed system there, but for people who don't know, it all passes a certain, it ticks all the checkboxes. It's is this thing evidence-based? They reference articles that look like they're scientific and academic papers. This organization, this Reproductive Health Research Institute, looks fully credible. It has a nice name. It's associated with a university. The professor is an endocrinologist. Everything looks to check out. And but then when we take a look at the details, who are the people associated, then that's when red flags appear.
And that leads us to, it's also a new component of this report to the previous report, I believe, the pseudoscientific services, as you label them, that are rooted in religious dogma. And I think it's especially important for SRHM audience or who are listening because it creates a new dynamics in health system, health service delivery. So what does it mean for healthcare when theology and ideology starts masquerading as science and enters to the health system domain and beyond?
Well, I think it's something that we need to be aware of. I mean, usually the idea of anti-gender services is something we put quite a bit of emphasis on because it's an area that we thought was not very well understood or not even recognized. Because usually the anti-gender organizations, we know about them when they make noise. So that there's an abortion law reform or something happening in a certain country, they mobilize against it. That's when we become aware of them. But when that's...
Can you just clarify that we don't talk about transgender services here?
Exactly, yeah.
Right? I think it's very important that we talk about the huge scale of sexual and reproductive health services.
Exactly, yeah. Transgender issues there's a separate dynamic which falls outside the scope of this report. But so with these anti-gender organizations, we know them when they make noise. But when they're not making noise, we found they're also very busy. And that's by developing what we call anti-gender services. So these are actual services that can be programmed and offered to the general population, which look like an actual health service, but meet a religious or ideological objective. And we identified a number of categories of them. One is natural family planning instead of actual access to contraception. And basically, this is the rhythm method developed by Catholic thinkers many decades ago, but then modernized in the form of apps. Now, natural family planning is not necessarily a bad thing if it is among the range of choices that is offered to women. But this is usually accompanied by disinformation about contraception and abortion. Then in relation to abortion, there we see that they offer crisis pregnancy centers, either actual fake health centers, or in some countries, such as in France, a fake hotline to provide false information about abortion. Then perhaps the best developed one is alternatives to CSE, to comprehensive sexuality education. These are nicely branded, modern-looking chastity-based education. I mean, the US under previous administrations, under Bush, was well known for exporting abstinence-based education, but we had been having this in Europe and around the world all this time. Some of them have been inadvertently funded by the EU, and they're operating now in a number of different European countries, but they look very modern, very slick, etc. And perhaps another one is NAPRO technologies, which is fake IVF, which is basically, if you think about it, it's the same as natural family planning, okay? It's basically the rhythm method, except the objective is to get pregnant rather than to avoid pregnancy. And then the final one is reintegrative therapy. This is to replace gay conversion therapy, which has had a bad reputation and been banned in many places. So the son of the inventor of gay conversion therapy has rebranded this and made it slightly different and called it reintegrative therapy. So it's basically Coke Light of conversion therapy. And these are being operated in some cases in Europe, and then from Europe also exported to other parts of the world.
So then you talk about political mobilization, you already mentioned at the beginning about the think tanks and the power brokers. You are calling them shadowy power brokers. Why are they shadowy power brokers?
Yeah, the shadowy power brokers is this subgroup of individuals and organizations that we found that are basically high-level consultants that broker relationships between high-level political personalities. So we found a certain number of them, some operating in Europe, some operating in the United States, who are behind a number of the higher-level political anti-gender activities or initiatives that we may have come across.
And then move to the last point in this section, or one of the last points about the misinformation, disinformation, the digital, because it has its own particular shape and dynamics as well.
Yeah. So here, this is really the disinformation, and especially in the digital sphere, is something that is really one of their new priorities as of this year. So it's even more recent than this report. And what we're seeing is that a certain subset of these anti-gender actors have recently pivoted towards becoming champions of digital deregulation. And so what we have is an alliance between Alliance Defending Freedom International from the United States with the Polish Ordo Juris, that's the organization behind the abortion ban, LGBT free zones, etc., and the Hungarian-funded think tank MCC Brussels, all working in a concerted but also individual capacity, calling on dismantling of the EU Digital Services Act. And they're doing this through a very coordinated strategy, starting with litigation in Finland around free speech and freedom of religion, with then a report in the US Congress in the Judiciary Committee on how Europe threatens Americans' free speech via the Digital Services Act, which was then welcomed by the Hungarian-funded think tank MCC, saying, aha, we knew that the EU was censoring via the DSA, and together launching an initiative against the DSA. The same Alliance Defending Freedom International serving as legal support to X and Elon Musk for the fine that was imposed upon it by the European Commission. Now, why do they want to dismantle the DSA? So as to have no regulation in place to allow for radicalization, including radicalization of young men and boys, because that provides a big base of support for far-right political parties to engage in polarization of society and polarization of the sexes of young men, young boys, and young girls. Also to allow for disinformation. One of the examples of EU censorship that should be condemned was blocking Russian-backed disinformation targeting female politicians in Moldova and in Romania in the recent elections. And then also just to allow grifts and scams and to say anything that you would like in digital spaces, such as fake health claims or about natural family planning or these types of things, from which they can also make money. So I think we need to see that the digital deregulation is one of the big areas of investment for the future of the anti-gender movement.
That take us that how European actors are catching up in the geopolitics and influencing the anti-rights, anti-gender European actors, influencing geopolitics and catching up to their US counterparts as key players in campaigns against the international norms, human rights standards, political agreements. And you are explaining that the strategies takes two or more forms. One is the norm spoiling, and the other one is the alternative norm creation. So how these practices look like and why the European, how they are gaining importance in this game.
Yeah. So what we have seen over the past couple of years is that European anti-gender organizations have internationalized, so that there's a certain number of them that are active or have even set up offices in other parts of the world. So we have one French anti-gender organizations with offices in Argentina and Washington, D.C. We have one of the big anti-gender organizations from Spain, Citizen Go, with offices in East Africa.
The bus is in Geneva at the World Health Assembly.
Exactly. Yeah. And we have the Polish organization behind everything bad, the organization called Ordo Juris, which has announced that they now have offices in New York and in Arusha in East Africa. And again, Arusha, that's because that's where a number of the East African institutions are located. We have that taking place. In terms of alternative norms, and I would say we've even gone into the phase of geopolitical engineering through anti-gender. If we take an example of what happened in Latvia just late last year, the Latvian parliament voted to exit the Istanbul Convention. This was paused by the head of state, but they voted for this. Now, what is behind this? It's not a debate about whether the Istanbul Convention is good or bad for gender-based violence. The idea behind this is to extract Latvia from the legal order of the Council of Europe, create tensions with West European, Strasbourg, Brussels-dominated institutions, and to bring it a little bit closer to the Russian sphere of influence. You have the same dynamic happening in Kazakhstan and in Georgia with the number of anti-LGBT laws that they have adopted. And the same dynamic is being played out right now on the African continent, where several laws have been adopted and proposed in Uganda against LGBT. These are as a result of, in part, American, Russian, and European anti-gender influences pushing the country of Uganda towards this illiberal model, creating tensions with the development partners from the global north, such as EU, UK, Canada, etc. And then these tensions allow then an opening for better relationships with illiberal actors. And I think we need to be very careful about what's happening in Africa right now. It was just about 10 days ago, maybe even less, where a number of these anti-gender actors converged in Accra, in Ghana, to adopt the so-called African Charter of Family, Sovereignty, and Values. And the idea, which is drafted by US Christian rights organizations, interestingly, a document proclaiming African sovereignty being drafted in Washington, they adopted this document. The participants were members of parliament, and the idea is that these members of parliament from 20 or so African countries bring this document back home to their national parliaments and present it for ratification at national level. And then once a certain mass has been obtained, critical mass has been obtained of national ratifications, to bring it up to the level of the African Union. Now, if we just think about this for a little bit, we have that dynamic happening, and then in parallel, the outreach of the US Trump administration to African countries, signing the overall MOUs, compacts, and funding for health issues, where for health issues, some of the public officials in the health systems, their salaries may be dependent upon US funding, and the countries have to agree to rather rigid constraints, including sharing health data information. And then separately, we have this charter of family values and sovereignty being adopted by the national parliament. We could have basically vassalization to the United States and to an illiberal way of addressing health and human rights and gender being championed as an expression of national sovereignty. So this is a worst case scenario, but it's a realistic one given the different processes that are happening at the moment. So within 2 to 3 years' time, this could very much change the dynamic in multilateral settings, not to mention the actual impact on laws, policies, and health services in the countries being affected by this.
So your conclusion paints a picture of a movement that isn't just ideologically loud like it was before, but financially armed, money from Moscow to Washington to Brussels to Budapest, hopefully not anymore, from aristocrats doing the heavy lifting in reshaping laws, policies, and public norms, influencing youth, evidence, science, political strategies, institutional powers, education. A movement this multidimensional demands a response that is equally multidimensional. And to be honest, I was thinking about, and I don't know what you think, but I almost feel that they studied the democratic movement and the human rights movement and recreated in every single part of it based on their own version. So, because the rights movement was influencing all of that in the past 70 years, since the conventions, the constitutions became rights-based. So, what do you think? So, what does a serious strategic counter-offensive look like across funding, politics, knowledge, media, and international institutions? Regional, we are coming out of the World Health Assembly that is full about health sovereignty, that on one hand is great, on the other hand, what happens if health sovereignty is matching with anti-rights politics? So how do you see a counter-offensive, coordinated, long-term visionary of countering all of this?
Yeah, excellent question. I think, first of all, we need to realize what game we're playing, okay? Most of us still have an outdated framework of what the actual anti-gender contestation is about. And I think maybe to provide an analogy, many people are still playing checkers, whereas we've gone beyond checkers, even beyond chess, and we're playing some type of multi-dimensional 3D Star Trek chess at the moment, with actors operating in many different levels and dimensions at the same time. We need to have this realization that this is what's happening. Related to this, we also need to understand this is not just about health norms or gender norms. It would be nice if we could simply argue about this and in a democratic setting. But gender, health, reproductive health is being used as a soft underbelly by which to undermine liberal democracy and rule of law. So we need to recognize it for what it is. It is part of an illiberal project. Okay. And now, once we have this understanding, we should be better able to mount appropriate resistance to it. So far, the resistance to it is still based on this outdated understanding, so that there's been a lot of effort focused on national level support, which is good. But at the same time, I think as we've been discussing over the past hour, this phenomenon is largely transnational, and we need to address the transnational dimension first of all. Secondly, many people still think of it as a messaging issue in that, or reframing narratives issue, thinking that we are engaging in a valid democratic debate, whereas we are seeing that democratic institutions are being undermined and taken over. So we need to see this also from a democracy perspective and have and fight at that level. The good point is that when I take a look at this movement, the key actors in this anti-gender, anti-rights ecosystem, the key civil society or at least non-state actors, basically we can boil them down to maybe 10, 15 actors. So that is something actionable. We need to come up with a way of recognizing who they are, by politicians, media, etc. What is really behind what they're trying to achieve, and then thinking of how it is that we can neutralize them. And I think that makes it a lot more achievable, rather than focusing on the fact that they're present in every country. They have almost $1.2 billion. They're doing this and that. If we boil it down to something that's manageable, based on a correct analysis, evidence-based analysis of this movement, then we can actually articulate real strategies.
So, Neil, you open your conclusion with Margaret Atwood. I believe in the resistance, as I believe there can be no light without shadow, or rather no shadow unless there is also light. You started to answer my questions, but what would it take to see the light, but also to turn the light into a fire, as a last point of this conversation?
Yeah, maybe just to summarize, we need to understand what is actually happening. What game are we playing? How serious it is? And at the moment, we still are in a very strong position. It's not because we've lost this or that the other side is gaining in certain areas. We're still in a very strong position. And our biggest vulnerability is not being aware of what's actually happening. So I think we still have it within us to organize and and put a stop to this movement from getting further.
Thank you so very much, Neil, for this exciting conversation, and thank you so much for your and EPF's amazing work, but also to your allies, because you worked with many different stakeholders and allies. And also congratulations to your funders of funding this work. And we are looking forward to hear from you in different forums, working with you. And for the listeners, please look at our blog page, visit the EPF webpage as well for the full report. Please prepare about 7 to 8 hours to read it, but it's worth every single word because we can learn so much from it. Thank you so much, Neil, and really appreciate for this conversation.
Thank you very much, Eszter. And just to thank my colleague Vladislav Ilijanin, who has been a great help with all of these research. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this insightful conversation. Please check the show notes for a link to the SRHM journal, which is available online and open access. Follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter to receive notifications for new publications. If you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe, give us a rating, or leave a review. Sharing evidence-based and rights-grounded knowledge is our passion, and it's also critical to support the advocacy and actions that need to be taken to improve SRHR for all. We would very much appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the SRHM Podcast, which is produced by our staff. The music was composed by Tiber Christian and Salomon Beautond.